This video is brought to you by Knowledge at the Australian School of Business. For more information, please visit knowledge.asb.unsw.edu.au.
Australia did fairly well in getting through the global financial crisis. Indeed, now there's almost a strong whiff of boom times being back in the air. However, a question remains as to whether all Australians face a payback for the $42 billion worth of stimulus package. Now, Professor Peter Swan from the Australian School of Business is with me. He's been looking at the issue. Peter, could you really tell me, do you feel initially that even the stimulus package was justified?
Julian, no, I don't think it was, certainly not of the magnitude that we had. And just to put it in perspective, coming into the global crisis, the Australian economy and its growth was one of the highest in the world, certainly the highest in the OECD nations apart from China. And you would expect, therefore, that we would need less stimulus given the size of our economy or per capita than the countries where it originated, such as the US and the UK. In fact, we ended up with the fourth highest stimulus package in absolute terms in the world, following just behind the US and the UK and perhaps Germany. So we've had a very severe penalty to pay in repaying the debts that the deficits funding the package have created, and there are a whole host of other aspects or consequences of this stimulus package, which are currently having very adverse impacts on the Australian economy.
And yet, if we look at the unemployment rate, for example, before the global financial crisis, it was only about 4.3% in Australia, and indeed in other developed economies around the world. Look at New Zealand, for example. We're currently at 5.3% for the unemployment rate. New Zealand, that didn't have anywhere near the stimulus package that Australia had, they're facing unemployment rates way over 7%. So if we didn't have the stimulus package that Australia ended up getting, would it be possible that we would actually be really in the mess, that we would have far higher unemployment?
That's very hard to answer definitively, but of course the Australian economy was in much better shape than the New Zealand economy going into the crisis. The New Zealand economy has been a far worse performer than Australia. Other countries like Canada that had very negligible stimulus packages are doing just as well as Australia and weren't that adversely affected by the crisis. And yet the consequences to us of these packages are really quite poor.
Okay, well, when you say that they're poor, what do you mean? Is there sort of a huge amount of debt that we're going to end up having to repay?
Well, there's a huge amount of debt. There is much more severe brakes being put on by the Reserve Bank, pushing up interest rates much more quickly than anywhere else in the world to cut back demand, to prevent a resurgence of housing demand, despite the fact we've had 5 or 10 years of very little housing new investment. And this is in part, as the Reserve Bank itself says, because of stimulus or excessive stimulus spending, or keeping on the stimulus spending way beyond what was required.
But surely some of the people in the housing market must be very grateful indeed. First-time buyers, for example, as part of the stimulus package, they got a huge range of benefits which enable them to buy a home for the first time. Are we storing up any difficulties there?
Well, Julian, that is a very good point that you raise, because if you remember, the global financial crisis actually came out of the subprime crisis, which was deliberately induced by the US government with the well-intentioned aim of improving the lot of the poor. In fact, in putting the poor into housing, and in particular housing that they owned. And it was this desire to get the poor into housing that caused the crisis in the first place. So I was very surprised at the time that the Australian government took on itself the very policies that had caused the global financial crisis as a way of alleviating the crisis, because what it's done is put tens and hundreds of thousands of Australians who are in a very precarious economic position, probably into housing that they can't really afford.
And surely, looking back at economic times, you only have to go back to the United States in 2006 and 2007, and then people said, yes, there are a lot of first-time buyers who are getting onto the housing market for the first time, but everything will be fine so long as house prices keep on rising and interest rates don't go up too much. Well, as we saw in the United States, then house prices started falling sharply, very sharply indeed, down by 40 or 50% in some cases. You can't be suggesting that would happen in Australia, though.
Well, I think it's hopefully it's fairly unlikely, but there is now less demand for lower quality homes, and certainly the pressure in the cheaper homes has come off the market, particularly with the almost unprecedented increases in interest rates that the Reserve Bank has brought about. I think the upper end of the market that didn't receive the stimulus is perhaps doing better, justifiably so, because there's been very little new construction for many years, and there is a genuine housing shortage, which has been exacerbated by these programs.
And to pay for all these programs, then obviously the Australian government ended up getting a huge amount of debt. What would happen if, say, there were future shocks to the financial system with all of that debt around?
Well, we've got some very good examples of what happens if countries persistently pursue Keynesian-type expenditure programs over many decades, as Japan, for example, has done, as the Greek government has done, as the Belgian government have done. All of these countries are in a very, very precarious position, as is even the UK, with huge debts often as great or greater than GDP, and very, very high interest commitments, and deficits are running around 10–12% of GDP as a result of pursuing these pump priming policies over many years. The result has been very poor economic growth, very, very poor prospects in future, and these countries are stuck with ageing populations like Japan, and very little, if any, way out of a situation which is getting worse and worse by the minute.
Okay, but we are in this situation where we have got a large amount of debt in Australia. A lot of people are obviously quite worried about it. How can Australia recover from this position, assuming the economic situation is pretty benign over the next few years? How can you actually rein in all that debt?
Well, it's inevitable that in one way or another the taxes are going to have to rise to pay for the debt, and this might be one of the reasons that the report on the changes to the taxation arrangements hasn't yet been released. I don't know whether it will be released before the election, which seems to be coming closer and closer. But I'm sure this report will canvass ways of raising taxes to pay for the inevitable growth in hospital costs. Overall, a very, very disastrous program.
Peter Swan, I'm sure it's a subject that we're going to talk about for probably many years to come. Peter Swan, thank you very much.
Thanks, Julian.
For more business news and analysis from Knowledge at the Australian School of Business, please visit knowledge.asb.unsw.edu.au.